Look, I love the big mainstream fantasy books as much as the next guy, but there are a ton of hidden gems out there that don't get anywhere near enough of a spotlight as they deserve. So in this video, I'm going to be giving spoiler-free reviews of my top 5 underrated, underhyped fantasy books. And if you're anything like me, you might find that these books become some of your favorite fantasy reads ever. So, starting with book number 5, we have Windhaven by George R.R. Martin and Lisa Tuttle. This came out in 1981, 15 years before the first Game of Thrones novel. Windhaven takes place on an alien world of small islands scattered about a harsh, monster-infested sea. After human starships crash land on the planet, they build metal wings, which allow them to fly between the islands. Generations later, the Silver-Winged Flyers are an elite cast who bring news, gossip, songs, and stories between the remote islands. We follow Maris, a fisherman's daughter who yearns to fly. She sets out to challenge tradition, demanding that flyers be chosen on the basis of merit rather than inheritance, and soon finds herself embroiled in a struggle to preserve the very fabric of this fragile society. Windhaven opens with a quote falsely attributed to this guy, Leonardo da Vinci, but actually said by John Secondary in the Saga of the Western Man. Once you have tasted flight, you will walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward. For there you have been, and there you would return. This perfectly encapsulates what makes this book so much fun. The flying scenes in this book are just exhilarating and ridiculously amazing. You really feel like you're soaring over the islands or gliding through the clouds or dodging between lightning strikes as you try to weave your way across these monster-infested seas. It also has a very cool structure. It's split into 3 parts, which follows Maris's childhood, adulthood, and elder years. So you really get to see Windhaven develop and progress over this time. And I love the fact that it's not just sort of this static, never-changing place, but you really see how the cultures evolve and adapt as a result of the world changing, as a result of what Maris does, and other various factors. By seeing Maris's development across her entire life as well, she just feels really complex and three-dimensional and realistic too. It, in many ways, feels like you're reading a memoir because you're seeing, the entirety of her life, essentially. Except it's just a memoir set in a really cool fantasy world. So read this book if you like How to Train Your Dragon. Book number 4 is The Language of Dying by Sarah Pinborough. This is a story about a woman who sits next to her father's bedside as the night ticks away the final hours of his life. As she watches him fade away, she recalls the past week that brought her fractured family back together, and she thinks about all the weeks beforehand that tore her family apart. While she sits through her lonely vigil, she remembers the magical creature she saw outside her father's house all those years ago, and she waits in the hope that this creature may return to her now in her moment of need. This is a really short and fleeting book. It's only 88 pages long, and yet, despite the short page count, it really manages to be such an emotional, gripping, and moving exploration of this woman's struggle with her father's mortality and her own grieving process, along with her relationship with her very fractured and conflicted family. And then, of course, there's the aspect of the magical creature. Does it exist? Is it a figment of her imagination? Either way, the book makes it into this really darkly fascinating, kind of shadowy metaphor for how we confront our own mortality and our own grieving in our lives. Perhaps the greatest praise I can give this book is that it weirdly actually made me more comfortable with the idea of mortality. Back when I read this a few years ago, I'd been lucky enough to not really have had too many major deaths in my family or in people close to me. And since then, that unfortunately hasn't been the case. And as I've kind of gone through those experiences, there's been a lot of things from this book that I have thought back to. And there are a lot of things that didn't really make sense to me at the time. But in hindsight, I really understand that this book is such a beautiful and sad and tragic and also uplifting exploration of this whole idea of death. And I kind of expect that as I get older, this book will continue to resonate with me. And that's such a special thing. Like, it's really rare to get a book that just ages better every time you think about it, let alone a book that is only 88 pages long. For it to pack in such a gripping portrayal of the human condition and how we deal with, our greatest enemy in death is just fascinating and a real credit to Pinborough's strength as an author. So read this book if you enjoy The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. Book number 3 is The Gutter Prayer by Gareth Hanrahan. This is a book about 3 young thieves caught in an ancient magical war between gods, monsters, ghouls, wormmen, tallymen, and magicians, all set within Gurdon, a city deep with secrets. Right from the start, the book just slams you with uniqueness and originality. The first chapter is narrated by a building, and that just gives you the perfect idea of Gareth Hanrahan's really wild and unique, but also really, really cool world building approach in this novel. A lot of fantasy books occur in these country-based settings. They're often about people traveling across a country in order to fulfill a dangerous quest. In fact, a book later on this list has that exact same trope, so I'm not against it. But when I read this book a few years ago, The Guide to Prayer really opened my eyes to how incredible it can be to set your fantasy story all within one city. Just keeping it in this sort of tightly self-contained setting can lead to some really interesting stories, especially when you're in the hands of a master world builder like Hanrahan. His world building is just incredible. Gurden is this city that feels so layered and complex, and there's all these shadowy plots and different factions that are warring with each other. And in a lot of ways, it kind of really resonated with me because when I read this book, I was working as an architect, and I love the ways in which he kind of uses the physical environments and the buildings and the landscapes of Gurden to really make it into a character and to make it feel like this vivid and realistic place with a lot of history to it. And the city of Gurden reminded me a lot of places like London and Rome, where you can go to these places and you just feel like all these layers of history from thousands of years worth of people living and, existing there and dying, and then this legacy kind of building up on top of the remains of the past. The way that Hanrahan actually set this book all in one city was a massive inspiration for me when I was writing The Thunder Heist, which is also set in this kind of darkly twisted, alchemical, sort of steampunky fantasy city. So thank you for the inspiration for that. I've had the pleasure to interview Gareth on 2 podcasts, and I also did another podcast where I analyzed how he went about the world building in the city of Gurden. So I'll link to those in the description down below if you want to check those out. Read this if you like The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch. Book number 2 is Blackstone Heart by Michael R. Fletcher. This book starts with a man crawling from his own grave. He can't remember anything about himself except 4 things: his name, a woman, a sword, and an obsidian path. When Crane discovers that his broken heart is made from stone and that he's missing pieces, he sets out to reclaim the shattered fragments of his former self. With each new splinter of his obsidian heart, he remembers more of his previous life. But as he does so, he begins to question whether he wants to reclaim his past self or whether that version of him is better off dead. Put simply, this is like the grimmest grimdark fantasy book I have ever read. It is not for the faint of heart, and I love it. The story is a primal and ruthless scream of aggression and of grit, exploring the absolute darkest aspects of human nature. Fletcher's willingness to really go the distance and to fully commit to the horror of Crane's story was hugely inspiring and very bold and brave. There's not a lot of authors that are willing to kind of go that distance, and it's why this book just feels so tense and exciting to read. It really feels like you're in a world where there are no rules. Now, I know I'm being kind of vague about the plot details here, but that is intentional because I went into this without knowing really anything about the narrative, and God, I am so glad that I did it that way, because the way that the story unfolds, it just goes in directions that you would not expect at all. And the best way to experience this story is the same way that Crane kind of experiences it. He wakes up with no memory, and then he discovers, what is happening as the story unfolds. And I think that's the best way that you should experience this book as well. I will say though that despite the darkness, it is actually a surprisingly funny and at times strangely uplifting book, despite everything that happens in it. It is not just self-consciously dark and gritty for the sake of being edgy and gritty. It does it for a genuinely interesting thematic reason. And yeah, there's lots of moments of levity and laughter amongst the darkness too. Like I said, this book really just explores all aspects of the human condition, from all the glory to all the tragedy. The magic system is also incredibly cool. What I like the most is how Fletcher really creates a sense of real consequences and stakes and costs for using the magic. It's not something people can just use as a easy get out of jail free card. It's something that really comes with some really big drawbacks in a lot of cases. And that all contributes to this wonderfully woven tapestry that explores these themes of sort of vengeance and greed and anger and lust and just all the aspects of the kind of darker sides of human nature. Best of all, this is book 1 in a trilogy, and I mean this in the best way possible. Blackstone Heart is the weakest book in this trilogy. It just gets better and better. Books 2 and 3 are phenomenal. This is one of the best, most consistently amazing fantasy trilogies I have ever read. And once you finish book 1, you will probably think, Jed, there's no way, you're hyping up books 2 and 3 way too much. Book 1 ends amazingly well. But no, it just gets better and better. I should also say that I'm lucky enough to be friends with Mike. We've done over 120 episodes of the Wizards, Warriors, and Words podcast together, which you can listen to in their entirety on this YouTube channel. And I bring that up because sometimes you can be hesitant about reading things that your friends have written, because then if they like ask you what you think about it and you didn't enjoy it, it can make for some really awkward interactions and conversations. And that's why I kind of put this book off for so long. But in hindsight, I'm glad I did it that way, because when I was reading this book, I was loving it so much that I was just like constantly messaging Mike and gushing over how good the story was, which is like fine after you've been friends for 2 years, but just like would have been weird if I had done it straight out of the gate. So read this book if you like The Bourne Identity or Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. Now, before I get into my top #1 pick, I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments down below what are some of your favorite underrated or underhyped fantasy books. Let me know, I would love to pick up some more reading suggestions. So, #1 is The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. This is a tale about a land under occupation, a legendary sword, and a young man's journey to find his destiny. After 2 young village boys are arrested for treason, they're rescued by a man who hates them, yet is oath-bound to protect them. They're dragged into a quest to free their people, and the key to this revolution is the Ember Blade. Only with the Ember Blade in hand can their people be inspired to rise up, but it's locked in an impenetrable vault in the most heavily guarded fortress in the land. So all they have to do now is steal it. Why did I like this book? I just love heists in general, but I also really love the fact that this big epic story is grounded by the friendship between Aaron and Cade, who are the 2 young boys I mentioned previously. Wooding just does such a wonderful job of showing these 2 young kids on the cusp of adulthood thrust into this really dangerous and extraordinary situation, and seeing the ways in which they are kind of forced to grapple with their newfound adulthood. It really makes for this like really strong emotional core to this big epic fantasy story. In essence, I would kind of describe this as just like this surprisingly poignant fantasy story about this ragtag group of people who have to come together to go on a very dangerous quest. And on the surface, that sounds a lot like Lord of the Rings. You know, you've got the Fellowship that gathers together, and like in Lord of the Rings, this Fellowship is hunted by these demonic creatures who are really scary and make the story feel very tense in a lot of times. But what this book does is it has this wonderful trick of presenting you with a setup that feels very classic fantasy, that has a lot of the familiar tropes that you love, like with Lord of the Rings, but then it just veers into a totally different and fresh direction that plays off the expectations you have in a way that's really intriguing. It just gets so complex and there's all this nuance to it, and it's amazing. Especially once it starts thundering towards the end, the last like 300 to 400 pages where they really get into the meat of that heist, just absolutely charges to the finish. And once you get there as well, the ending is so beautiful, sweet, and fitting for the story. It actually like made me cry. And that's pretty rare for a book to do that. There's probably maybe like 5 or 7 books that have made me cry. So the fact that this was able to get me to such a level of emotional connection and empathy for the characters is a real credit and testament to how good this story is. If you want more of my thoughts on this, I actually made a podcast analyzing the opening 50 pages of this novel in fine-tooth detail, so I'll link to that again in the description down below. Really cool as well, book 2 in this series comes out in February of 2023. I'm interested to see how it goes actually, because book 1 works totally well as a standalone. It really wrapped up the story, for me at least, in a very satisfying way, but I can totally see how the second book will have a lot of interesting areas to explore as well. Murakami once said that if you only read the books that everybody else is reading, you can only think what everybody else is thinking. So I hope that my little list has given you some hidden gems in the fantasy world that you may not have heard of before. Let me know your favorite underrated fantasy books in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this video, you might like this video I made about my top 10 favorite fantasy books of all time.